Welcome back. This is your eNCA Corruption Scorecard. We continue our conversation with Gareth, Newham and Jacques Pauw about the situation in the intelligence structures of the country, particularly the rampant looting that has happened there over the years. Gareth, let me ask you, we're decrying the fact that there's not much by way of oversight, simply because there's this cloak of how much do you really want to reveal, right, about the operations of your intelligence agencies. But we are a democratic country founded on the Constitution that provides for oversight whenever even a rand is spent of public monies. So what we do have at the moment is the Inspector General of Intelligence, meant to sort of investigate complaints by the public against the intelligence agencies. But we also have the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence. What's your sense? Are they getting more effective?
Well, I think it's difficult to talk about whether they're getting more effective or not because of the amount of secrecy around so many of the investigations and allegations. One of the challenges has to be with the overall approach or model of intelligence. I think we referred to this a bit earlier. In a democracy where we're all free, national security shouldn't be something that very few people decide what are the threats. It's something that there should be a national threat analysis that's released annually and is open for discussion and debate so that we can all decide, are we really facing these threats or not? If people are using protests to raise their grievances about labour conditions or about service delivery, is that a national threat or is that a domestic threat, and how should we best deal with that? So I think the problem really still is that there is excessive secrecy in our intelligence capacity. In some other countries, the capacity that does covert surveillance and very highly intrusive investigations is actually quite small and targeted against very specific networks and groups. Whereas here, our default position is secrecy. So, for example, the Portfolio Committee on Intelligence, it shouldn't be defaulted to secrecy. It should be defaulted to openness and transparency, and only when it's specifically mentioning or overseeing something could really compromise the operations that are in progress or modus operandi that they're using to go after very organized, sophisticated criminal networks in the state or in the private sector. Only when it's going to compromise that should it be secret. But you can see already that we just default to secrecy. And the same thing with the IGI. How would you know to lay a complaint if the intelligence services were illegally spying on you? Because they know how to spy on you without you knowing. And so there's a whole lot of push to get legislation in place that says that they must by law tell you that they spied on you 6 months after they ended the operation at least, so that you can find out what they revealed and how they did it, because if nothing happened to you, then there might have not been a reasonable reason to spy on you, for example. So I think we need to really shift our approach and understand that national security can only be served if we're all acting in our national interest, if we all know what the threats are, and we all trust our agencies to work with us to deal with those threats.
Let me move from the bigger conceptual issues to specifics of the cases that are coming up. Gareth, let me stick with you. When we talk about the case that Richard Mdluli will be facing and others in the coming weeks, I think the other person is Anthony Lazarus, I believe the name is. When they are hauled before the courts, what are your expectations? We have already seen a glimpse of some of that evidence that perhaps will form part of the state's case when they appear in court. Much of what, for instance, a person like Thulasizwe, the Hawks investigator, was testifying to, he kept running into these roadblocks that, while these documents are classified and therefore I can't use them to sort of inform this commission. Do you expect that the case itself in court will face the same obstacles, or has there been some work to try and get some of those declassified?
Yes, well, that is often the response by people in intelligence that are being investigated to say, well, the information you acquire is classified. So that is a very well-worn technique to try and avoid being held accountable and avoid the evidence from being used. I think the NPA was aware of this, very much so, because of exactly the kinds of challenges that are really emerging from rule officers' testimony and other investigations in the past. So I don't know the details, but there was attempts to declassify it. I suspect that now, given that the criminal charges are formally before the courts and the trial or process will start in November, that they have enough evidence that they've been able to declassify to uphold certain criminal charges of fraud and corruption. It might not be everything, but certainly I don't think the NPA at this point would actually go to court if they hadn't been able to declassify that information. But we will have to wait and see exactly what happens when this court case unfolds.
Absolutely. Jacques?
I believe the information has just been declassified by the Commissioner of Police. Now, it took 8 years for the declassification of the material, of the evidence. Now, in the evidence against Richard Mdluli and Lazarus are no state secrets. This was just pure fraud. And you can't classify fraud. But this is what the intelligence services have been hiding behind for many, many years. There's one thing I want to add, and many of the viewers might not be aware of this. But I want to go back to a most interesting conversation in January 2019, I think, between the IGI, Dr. Dintwe, and the public protector, Advocate Mkhwebane. And this became part of a court record, and that's why the conversation is now in the open, is now public knowledge, is where Dr. Dintwe talked about the amount of documents that had been destroyed at the State Security Agency. And he specifically mentions Arthur Fraser. And he said Arthur Fraser have destroyed a lot of documents before he left. Obviously documents pertaining to the PAN operation and the Special Operations Unit. And then he also tells Advocate Mkhwebane that when he assumed office at the IGI, they received stacks of documentation in 2014 about the role of the Special Operations Unit in capturing SARS, in getting rid of Ivan Pillay, Johan van Ochrenberg, and the others. Those documents are all gone. It's disappeared from the IGI's office.
That's a problem if you.
That's a huge problem. Now, what we're dealing with here is fraud. I mean, some legal experts might even tell you if you destroy intelligence documents, it might even amount to treason. Where are those investigations? You know, I have no reason to suspect Dr. Dintwe of anything. He might be a most credible person. But there's a problem in that there's no oversight over the IGI. Is he doing his work? What's happening to his investigations?
Yeah, so I must mention, now that you say that, Jacques, that we also reached out to the IGI's office, and admittedly we were late in doing that, so it was at the 11th hour, and we are trying to coordinate and see if we can bring them onto this show as part of that oversight, to really ask the questions, because we can't keep doing things the same old way. Let me ask you, Jacques, and stick with you. Arthur Fraser says, when I get to the state capture and I'm sitting there in front of Justice Ray Zondo, I will spill the beans. I will have to reveal secrets that I had told myself that I will take them to the grave with me. But I've seen the likes of Gibson Njenje and Jeff Maqetuga come before the commission, and they were speaking freely, and it's my turn to speak my truth. Do you have high expectations of that testimony?
No, no, I don't. Because I don't think that Arthur Fraser for a minute can afford himself, will tell everything. It's too dangerous for him. He's not going to compromise himself that much. The problem for Arthur Fraser is if he appears in front of the Zondo Commission, in front of the State Capture Commission, he will have to be cross-examined. And that would be very interesting. But I don't believe for a moment that he's going to go to the State Capture Commission,
so he won't
and he's going to tell everything.
He won't be a biblical Samson, you know, pushing the pillars apart and
I don't believe so.
And letting the house collapse with everyone.
This man has too much to lose. He's still a top civil servant. He's still the Director General of Correctional Services. He's not going to compromise himself in any way.
Yeah.
So I still want to see whether he ever appears before the State Capture Commission. Remember, there's lots of people who have been implicated, who have said, oh, I'm going to go and testify and I'm going to tell my story. Very few of them have done so.
All right. Gareth, let me bring you back into this conversation and ask you about the desirability, because part of what we started off talking about here, the financial corruption and fraud in these intelligence agencies, the one thing they have in common, both at the Crime Intelligence and State Security Agency, is that there's some kind of a secret service slush fund right, to allow agents to dip into it, as many companies, for example, has a petty cash box where you just basically get a few thousand rand and you are able to carry out the operations without the whole process. What's the desirability of us continuing with that model that, some of these agencies, given the nature of the work that they do, they need to have some kind of a kitty? And does the kitty need to amount to hundreds of millions of rand, for example?
Well, I think we certainly need to increase the oversight of the expenditure of these budget line items, we could call them, or slush funds. Obviously, they are needed, and there does need to be a certain amount of secrecy about what the money is being spent on, because there are people involved in counterintelligence trying to see what crime intelligence are doing or what state security is doing, and so you can't make it too open, of course. But I certainly think that the ways in which these slush funds have been managed in the past, they were literally open to being completely looted. So hundreds of millions of rands just goes missing, and no one ever gets asked any questions. The Auditor General can't get detailed enough information. So clearly that wasn't working. And I think it might be more that the process for asking for funds has to be much more rigorous. That if you are wanting to access secret money, to do a legitimate bona fide intelligence operation, that at that point there still needs to be a lot of focus on exactly what are you going to be spending it on, or how you're going to be doing that, and then to make sure that there's a proper, thorough auditing process after that to make sure that money was actually spent in the way it was supposed to have been done. And there are various models for doing that. But certainly we have seen in the past that it was probably the worst possible way of managing money in our intelligence agencies, right, because it was computed.
All right, Gareth Newham, thank you for your time, and Jacques Pauw, thank you so much for coming through and having this conversation with me. One word, have you been sued following this successfully? I thought you'd be broke by now.
At some point I faced 11 threats of defamation. There's still one standing by Arthur Fraser. He says I destroyed his business. There's a question mark about why a top civil servant had a business, but the case hasn't been moving forward.
But nothing about you, what you say about him. It's about his business. All right, thank you for that. Jacques Pauw is the author of The President's Keepers and also a veteran journalist in this country.